We have worked on 4 scenarios, which are describing the world of 2050. The first scenario is what we call AI abundance. It's a world where AI is dominant, but in a positive way. It is a world which shows a huge increase of productivity. We will see a multiplication of global GDP by 3.8x in 25 years. That would be the fastest GDP growth the globe has ever seen. Second scenario is what we call battling blocks. It's a world of geopolitical confrontation, a very strong multipolar world with different regions that do not communicate with each other, that are focused on themselves, and also a high preparation for conflict. And then the third scenario is what we call the climate coalition, the world where after major natural catastrophes in the 2030s, the world comes together to push a stringent decarbonization. GDP growth would be lower. There would obviously also be higher taxes to finance this climate transition. And then the fourth scenario is called Digital Darwinism. It's a world where countries are trying to attract as much tech investment as possible with as low hurdles as possible from a regulatory point of view. It's a world where tech generates a lot of value, but a value that is not distributed in an equal way, but that is favoring countries that are advanced on technologies, and where I would say the risk of social tension and social inequality is very high.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Boundaryless Conversations podcast. On this podcast, we explore the future of business models, organizations, markets, and society in our rapidly changing world. I'm excited today to have with us Nikolaus Lang. Nikolaus is a managing director and senior partner in the Munich office of Boston Consulting Group and global leader of the BCG Henderson Institute, and one of the lead authors of a fantastic report that was released recently. The report is called Beyond Tomorrow: 4 Scenarios for the World of 2050. Hello, Nikolaus. Good to have you.
Yeah, it's great to be with you, Simone. Thank you for having me.
I'm super thrilled to welcome Nikolaus because this report starts from a simple but uncomfortable idea. While most of the leaders are absorbed by quarterly pressures, annual plans, or at best, let's say, 5-year strategies, the choices they make now are probably going to impact how their companies adapt and the ability for them to thrive in the next 25 years. So what I appreciated a lot about this piece of work is that it does not just try to predict the future, but instead it builds for plausible and, to be honest, also deliberately uncomfortable scenarios. And in these conversations, we will unpack those scenarios, but also, and most importantly, what are the low regret moves that organizations need to take now to be able to adapt to this upcoming future. So before we enter the 4 words, let's say the scenarios, what was the original question that prompted the BCG Henderson Institute to create this incredible piece of work, Nikolaus?
Well, Simone, I think what is interesting is that, and you described it very well, when you talk to corporate leaders today, and even in the past decades, they're caught between 2 extremes. One is the quarterly pressure, and on the other side, the attempt to do long-range planning. Traditionally, the long-range planning was always quasi-perfect, which means that companies were predicting their revenues or their bottom line 10 years ahead to the dollar or the yen or the euro unit. And of course, the reality we've seen, and I think the acceleration of a multipolar world, the high frequency of exogenous shocks and so on, has actually changed the way how companies need to do long-range planning. So what triggered this report was the fact that more and more CEOs or board chairs approached me and said, Nikolaus, how should we think about the future? Is there actually one future? And my answer is consistently no. I think the worst thing you can do is prepare for one single future. I think you need to prepare for several futures because we actually don't know where the future will land. This is how we started to do scenarios. And I always keep saying one thing which I think is really important. The beauty of scenarios is that they're precisely wrong, but generally right. And that means that it gives you an option space, a range of plausible futures for which you need to prepare. The next step was that I said, well, there are so many scenarios that are qualitatively described, fluffy words, this could happen, this should happen, and stuff like this, that I said, we need to give it another quality. We need to go beyond the qualitative scenarios, and we need to actually go into a very stringent quantification. And I think this is what makes this report really unique, is that we have said, okay, we take 100 megatrends, we look at 20 KPIs, ranging, and we'll talk about this later, Simone, but from GDP to defense spending to biodiversity to life expectancy, working hours. And for each of the scenario, we come up with a set of quantitative hard facts of how the world in 2050 could look like. I think the combination of the qualitative and the quantitative dimension make that work quite unique.
So let's look into these 4 scenarios, because I think it's a good starting point for the conversation. Of course, I will point the listeners to go and read the report, but maybe we can paint the 4 scenarios quickly so that we have something to hang on.
Yeah, look, I think what we have done is we have worked on 4 scenarios, as you rightfully described it, which are describing the world of 2050. Those scenarios are, of course, divergent because we want to have different worlds and we want to have different dimensions here. But so the first scenario is what we call AI abundance. As the name says, it's a world where AI is dominant, but in a positive way. There has been a global coalition of AI powers to make sure that AI is being used in a positive and value accretive and societally valuable way. It is a world which shows a huge increase of productivity. We will see a multiplication of global GDP by 3.8x in 25 years. That would be the fastest GDP growth the globe has ever seen, 5% per year. And we would have, of course, let's say, a general positive development also on working hours, positive in the sense that people would move at a global level more to a 4-week working week instead of 5 days, we have today. So I think moving from 5 days to 4 days working time is an interesting development, productivity increase, GDP growth, and I would say a beneficial tech perspective. Second scenario is what we call battling blocks. I would say this is more the other side of the development, as the name says. It's a world of geopolitical confrontation, a very strong multipolar world with different regions that do not communicate, in different blocks that do not communicate with each other, that are focused on themselves, with regional supply chains, with regional technology stacks, with regional regulations, and also a high preparation for conflict. So just to give you an order of magnitude, defense spend would be at 7% of GDP, which would be even higher than what the world was spending during the Cold War, where we were roughly at 6% of world GDP on defense. Then the third scenario is what we call the climate coalition. The climate coalition is a world where after major natural catastrophes in the 2030s, the world comes together to push a stringent decarbonization, probably on a 1.8 centigrade path. But of course, these climate resilient and climate positive scenarios comes with a certain cost. So GDP growth would be lower. There would obviously also be the higher taxes to finance this climate transition. So I think it shows the balance of having a safer environment, but also the cost of this. And then the fourth scenario is called Digital Darwinism. That's what I call a little bit the law of the jungle. It's a world where actually countries are trying to attract as much tech investment as possible with as low hurdles as possible from a regulatory point of view. It's a world where tech generates a lot of value, but a value that is not distributed in an equal way, but that is favoring countries that are advanced on technologies and obviously also companies, and where I would say the risk of social tension and social inequality is very high. So these are the four scenarios that we describe in our report with also the subsequent set of data, as I mentioned before.
I think it's interesting to look at the measures that you have identified in the report as to characterizing the scenarios, right? And let me mention them. I see world GDP growth, which is an indication of, generally speaking, how much growth, let's say, the world will experience without a qualitative, let's say, analysis of it. And then there are a bunch of elements instead that somehow help us understand what type of growth it's happening in the four scenarios, because there is global trade to GDP ratio that tells us a lot about how fragmented the world will be, global defense spending, which is again another expression of conflicts and conflicting elements in the world of tomorrow, poverty, extreme poverty ratio, so that's another indication of how big the gap will be between maybe the leaders of the future and the followers, right? The countries that will struggle to maybe catch up, and of course, global temperatures. Climate change is something that I think we cannot really underestimate. So I think these are very important points, and I'd be curious to see if in the process of choosing these KPIs, let's say, why did you choose these ones, or maybe where are there elements on the radar and then you decided to go for this because you believe those are the most important pieces of the picture?
No, I think, Simone, you're bringing up a very important point, which is what are the quantitative data we take to really kind of measure and depict the future. And, I think it comes back to the structure of the BCG Henderson Institute. You know that we have 6 labs. We have a tech and AI lab, we have a macroeconomic lab, we have a geopolitics lab, we have a climate lab, we have a human futures lab, and we have a strategy lab. And actually, the report is a collaboration of these 6 labs, because each lab was in charge of defining the 2 or 3 KPIs that would be the most meaningful KPIs with regard to describing the future world. And so on human futures, for example, we look at life expectancy, but we look also at working hours. On climate, we have been looking, as we mentioned, at biodiversity, but also the ratio of non-abated fossil fuels. And of course, on GDP, as you said, it's one of the most obvious one. It's GDP growth, it's the regional GDP split, and so on. So what I think is interesting is you ask, why have we chosen those? I think there are 3 reasons why we try to go through the KPIs. Number one, of course, the KPI has to be meaningful. So it has to describe in a positive way each of the dimensions. For example, on geopolitics, we said, well, it's a combination of trade ratio and defense spend. So that's one. The second criteria we have been looking at is, and you have seen, is our methodology is not to sit here in 2025 or 2026 and to happily project into the future, but our projection is actually informed by a very long-term backward looking into the trend. So for example, for GDP, we have almost 200 years of GDP development. In other criteria, we have more like 50 or 70 years because the data was not available. But what we wanted to do is we wanted not to kind of do a happy guesstimate about how GDP would evolve, but we would go and really have a very precise view of saying, how did GDP develop in the past and what is then a realistic projection going forward? And let me come back to this in a second. And then the third dimension is, of course, also having a reasonable amount of KPIs. We could have come up with 120 KPIs, but we thought that having 20 is on the upper limit of what's understandable and at the same time a good description of where the world is heading.
These 4 scenarios look like 4 polarities somehow, right? My guess, and I would like to ask you about this, is that the future is going to be a bit of a mix, maybe, of those scenarios, right? So we see pieces of these scenarios show up. So have you been thinking about how this mix could happen? Is it a mix that happens geographically, or is it a mix that happens, what I mean here is, it depends on where you are in the world, you're going to see different mixes of these scenarios, or maybe in general, the future will probably show up as a mix of elements, and how this mix is coming up in your perception?
So yes, of course, we don't say that this will be the world will only be one scenario or another. As I said at the beginning, I think the beauty of scenarios is that they're precisely wrong but generally right. Nevertheless, I think it's important to say that we need to have scenarios answering questions like, okay, what's the future development of technology? How beneficial or how critical will it be? What is the future development of geopolitics? How open, how closed the world will be? So I think the big questions behind the scenarios will be those that companies need to monitor and to see whether there is a mix of scenarios or not coming up. But you bring a thought which I think is super important as we talk, which is also a lot of people always ask me and say, "Hey, but why haven't you included Black Swan events? Yeah, like fusion, like AGI, like a pandemic, like war in space." And I think when you really think about the future and when you look at future planning, you actually realize that these black swan events are long tail risks. They are not 0%, but they are very low probability. And so, if you're a corporate leader, you should prepare your company for whatever the 90% probability. You might have some risk mitigation rules for the long tail risk, but your strategy needs to be anchored around what we would still say quite diverse and divergent scenarios, but still plausible scenarios. We always called it stretched but plausible scenarios, and that's what we have been doing on this report.
This is a very interesting point because as I was looking into introducing the 5 low regret moves, I feel like these 5 low regret moves that you have in the report are roughly grouped in, let's say, 3 clusters, right? So let me introduce it to the readers. So the 5 moves are essentially enhance structural resilience, which means intervene into your organization to make it structurally adaptable, let's say in a few words. Then building digital flexibility and trust, which is, I think, something related to the first. So it's really about having an organization that architecturally is able to swap and modify pieces and modularly reorganize. So it's about modularity, adaptability, both on a technological and organizational standpoint. So this is the first cluster. Then there are 2 more clusters, I think, from what I understand. One is the cluster of having an organization that is able to sense the future coming and play a broader influencing role in society, right? So it's organizations need to be able to understand what's going on and show up in society, shape direction, policy, and have a broader societal role. These are other 2, let's say, moves that you have identified. And then there is a third leg, which is the leg of reimagining talent for aging population and AI, which is also something that is changing radically. So we are seeing deep depopulation trends, aging, it's coming up. So of course, we have to think about how do we manage people and talent in a world where increasingly we're going to have a workforce which is mixed of aging players, AI, and traditional employees in the productive age. So these are the 3 major legs I see in the low regret moves. Do you feel like I've got it well, or do you want to make some adjustments to the picture?
No, I think you got it well, maybe 1 or 2 additions, but you're right. So let me go through them. I think one of the key elements as we think about the future is actually really what you call the structural resilience. And the structural resilience is, people ask me always, say, well, what do you mean with this? I tend to give them a very simple example. I said, like 20, 30 years ago, when you were a corporate leader, the smartest thing you could do is to create a big factory, let's say a 1 million unit factory at the lowest cost location possible on globe. Again, let's assume you produce t-shirts, you went to Bangladesh, you did 1 million t-shirts in Bangladesh, and you exported it from Bangladesh around the world. Now, what has changed in the meantime is that you have had pandemics, you have had supply chain disruptions, you have had tariffs, you have had import restrictions, and so on and so on. And that realizes the fact that you have actually to move from your 1 million t-shirt factory to probably 100,000 t-shirt factories that will be much closer to the end markets, such as maybe Morocco, Tunisia, Ukraine, Turkey for Europe. So structural resilience resilience means breaking up super concentrated production networks in much more agile modular production networks and patterns. So that's one. But you also have structural resilience, obviously, when it comes to your organization model. Yeah, again, in the past, you used to you had one company that had a headquarter in the US or in Japan or in Europe. The reality today is that as we move to a multipolar world with different tech stacks, different regulations, we see more and more companies setting up regional headquarters that are almost as powerful as the central headquarter, and which also allows you to decouple an organization in the case of major geopolitical shifts. That's what we describe with structural resilience. Then I think you brought up the role of the societal role. I think more and more we see companies playing a role in the communities they work in. And this goes beyond building schools and paying teachers in a mining region in Africa or something like this. It's really about what can companies contribute to the major societal shifts, be it demography, be it education, be it economic inequality. And I think that will also allow companies to be much better anchored in their ecosystem in which they are. So I think companies that are well embedded in the ecosystems, in the societies, in the nations in which they are much more resilient than those who are not embedded. And then you brought up a third topic, which was the topic of talent and demography. Yes, I think it's very important that we look at what are actually the challenges that we are handling, both in terms of making talent skilled and right skilled and upskilled for AI, but at the same time, obviously also being aware that we might have more experienced employees playing an important role as expertise also plays an important role. But then there are two elements which at least I would like to emphasize more is one is the whole topic around digital and digital trust, and I would say also digital flexibility. Personally, I think this is one of the biggest risks we are having is that many corporate leaders and even policy leaders have still not understood what I call the geopolitics of tech or the geopolitics of AI, where we see a massive bifurcation of the tech stack between an American-led tech stack and a China-led tech stack. And I think a lot of people need to take decisions on whether they want to go one way or the other. And so again, companies that have a view on how to handle these bifurcated tech stacks will be much more resilient going forward. And last but not least, and that's maybe more a technical point of view, is that we think that companies are more resilient if they really have the muscle to do all the kind of forecasting, long-range planning, including the macroeconomic, technical, geopolitical, societal dimensions we mentioned before. Again, I think in the past we used to do long-range planning with one number at the end in 10 years from now. Now it's a much more complex task. So that would be, from my point of view, the 5 no-regret moves I would see from the report.
It's interesting because you mentioned a few minutes ago that people ask you about black swans and you classified them as long-tail events that you cannot really design for. But I think, if you look at a few of the major low regret moves that you mentioned, but especially maybe the enhancement of the structural resilience of the organization, but also the capability to understand how technology and digital elements should be tools, the alternatives you have to create, and be more sovereign when it comes to your technological choices. I think these are both responding to black swan stressors, right? So, for example, structural organizational modularity, what we could call organizational adaptability. This is essential to respond also to black swan and edge stressors and long tail events, right? So I'm curious to how do you see the best companies in the world doing pioneering work in their organizational structure. Of course, this is sensitive for us because Boundaryless is all about is working really on modular organizations, micro enterprises, adaptability. We really see in the future of companies going beyond matrix or functional structures, much more into micro-enterprise, powered, shared services, contracts. So how do you see this happening at the moment in the organizational space? What are the pioneers doing to become structurally resilient and modular?
Well, I think, the resilience is actually, and I would say when you look at it, we often talk about the topic of buffering, and we describe this in 3 dimensions. We say it's first redundancy, second is modularity, and third is heterogeneity. So what do I mean with this? I think on redundancy is pretty clear, is what I just described in our previous this question, which is to say, okay, look, I don't want to have only one supplier, I don't want to have only one factory, but I'd actually have 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 factories that allow me to really kind of increase production in one place versus another one if something should happen to a specific factory. And we have seen this with earthquakes, we have seen this with wars and stuff like this. So that's one. Second, modularity is actually to make sure that you make breaks between the different factories or the different units, that when there's a problem in one, you can actually protect the others. And that's also the point where actually in a modular factory, you have the possibility to run several products going forward. And then on heterogeneity is, I think that in each of these units, you need to be able to produce not only different products, but you need to be also able to introduce new products, to introduce new, in this case, cars, for example, to be able to serve your end client. So for me, I think when I look at what are best-in-class companies, they are extremely strong when it comes to redundancy in the supply chain, which means when from the supplier to the production, they're looking at having a modular production network where they can protect different units one against the other. They can move capabilities, and then I think we also see that the production units themselves are getting more agile, more flexible, and that's what we call heterogeneity.
I'm wondering if you see impacts on the product side. What I mean here is, if you look into an organization and you want to make it modular, adaptable, you want to distribute more autonomy to the nodes, both in terms of supply chain decisions or in terms of product decisions, the end result is typically that you end up with a company which have a much stronger portfolio motion, more optionality. A few months ago, your colleague Martin Reeves wrote, and others, they wrote this article called, if I'm not wrong, calling for radical optionality, right? So the idea that companies need to develop more options, right? A broader portfolio of products and services. So can we just reasonably confidently say that the future of companies is about more options, more diversity in products and services, both regionally, but also from the perspective of maybe the layers of the value chain where these products are showing up. So, for example, maybe it could be an end user product, but at the same time, a B2B product that valorizes one piece of the value chain that exists in the company and can connect it to partners, but also competitors maybe at some point, right? So are we going to see a much broader portfolio and optionality in the future of organizations?
Yeah, for sure. I think, look, when you look at optionality, I think this is something which is on the rise and has to be on the rise, because the optionality allows you to buffer the shifts and shocks that we have seen over the last 5 to 10 years. You're absolutely right that one element of optionality is not only, we discussed a lot before about where do I source from and where do I produce, but it's also in the product and the service you deliver to end customer. Again, I think whether you take consumer electronics, whether you take automotive, whether you take consumer goods in more general, I think this one single world product, I think, is a dying species. Yeah, there are very few single products. I think we will always see some kind of regional adaptation or even regionally grown products. So from that perspective, we have much more regional supply chains. If I come back to my example of the t-shirt factory, I think, and I'm just using this because of simplicity, but you used to do one type of t-shirts 1 million times out of one location in the world. Now, if you have 10 factories, probably these 10 factories are closer to the end consumer markets. They will capture more of the end consumer demand and requests. Hence, the t-shirt might not be the same in all those 10 factories. It might be, but it might be much closer to the taste of the respective end consumer segments. So I think that's the trend we see clearly. Yeah.
I mean, this is very resonant to another thing that you said, which struck a chord with me because you spoke about embeddedness. And I think this is something that most of the companies I talk to still don't have on the radar. So we speak a lot about organizational adaptability, modularity, entrepreneurship, having micro-entrepreneurial units, having less monopolies and less constraints. But very rarely companies understand that in their future there needs to be a much stronger integration in their landscapes, in their communities, in their localities, right? So isn't this something that came up strongly in the report or in the research? And how are you seeing organizations understanding that in their future there may be less globalization and much more localization?
Yeah, so I think these are two questions. One is, I think companies have realized that we have moved from a monopolar world to a multipolar world. And as I said already before, I think we are in a world where companies are operating in geographies with different regulation, different political regimes, different economic imperatives, different tech stacks, and so on and so on. So I think this one world model doesn't exist anymore, already for quite some time. Now, the second part of your question was about shouldn't then companies, given that there is not this global world model, spend more time on being locally active and locally embedded? And I would answer this with an emphatic yes, of course. I think it's really important for companies to play a role that goes beyond the immediate P&L. I think we have seen this with community engagement, with educational engagements. We have seen this with broader societal engagement. And again, I think every company that plays a role in a society, which is also valued for this role by government authorities, is more resilient than a company that is being felt as a strange body in a societal ecosystem.
So this is really beyond CSR, right? It's really strategic in terms of sourcing employees, sourcing materials, also influencing policy. Am I right?
Yes. I think it's definitely beyond CSR. It's definitely beyond CSR. What and how the companies are doing and shaping depends a lot on the regional setup, depends a lot on where things evolve, but yes.
I'm hearing you speaking about organizations becoming much more modular, interconnected, much more open to partners, local ecosystems. So this, I guess, also entails deep questions, for example, when it comes to brands or management practices. So how do you see the incumbents reacting to that? So in the future, do you believe that we are seeing or we should see incumbents adapting and transforming, or we are more likely to see upstarts and new type of organizations, maybe with new structures coming up and somehow challenging the incumbents?
Well, yeah, I think, there has always been incumbents being challenged by startups. I think this is something when you look at back in history, this is not something that is new. And we also have to be pretty clear that the average life expectancy of a Standard & Poor's company, a 500 company, is somewhere between 20 and 30 years. So it's not something which is new. But on the other side, you're right. I think the geopolitical development around the world, the rise of course, China, of India, of many global South countries, at the same time as we have the massive acceleration on the tech and AI side, gives way to the rise of a lot of startups that either try it by themselves or try to connect themselves to incumbents. But what it does in any case is that it puts pressure on the incumbents to evolve. And I quote one of my clients in the automotive industry who says, well, I'm not sure if Tesla is building the best electric vehicles and will be the biggest electric vehicle producer in the future, but one thing that Tesla has made is that it has moved the whole industry towards EVs in a speed and a magnitude that no one would have expected in the early 2000s. So I think startups have the beneficial impact of putting incumbents on the path of evolution, of accelerated evolution. And I think that's something we've seen in the past and will continue to develop in the future.
Yeah, maybe this also has implications in terms of how the industry is generally modularized and transformed to enable this new age of more adaptive customers. So maybe some other incumbents will have to somehow play a more enabling role, not to that system of upstarts that will emerge by making their own services and products more modular and more enabling for smaller companies that want to build upon. And this connects with the topic of ecosystems and platforms. So becoming platforms, becoming ecosystem organizers for companies, for incumbents, may mean that they have to transform their vertically integrated services into something that is more like an enabling network of components and capabilities that more partners can use. Are you seeing that also these in the plans?
Yeah, of course. No, look, if you pull together three things, one is I think we discussed about the fact that the world is getting more fragmented and multipolar, number one. Number two is you see a massive impact of high frequency shifts and shocks. Number three is that we have the emergence of new players next to incumbent players. I think the solution for this is you will not go into a model where the company owns everything everywhere around the world, but that the setup will be much more fluid, will be much more, I would say, agile and modular. And that's very clear. I think all these trends.
It's fascinating how you make it so straightforward, and most of the companies, I guess, on the market and that we know will be somehow terrified at the same time by this perspective. From their management culture.
Yeah. It's a total shift. Like, of course, a company that, I don't know, take a theoretical company who used to have, 50 factories around the world, all controlled by one headquarter, and was churning out a set of relatively standardized product is, of course, very different from the model you just described, where you say, oh, I have a fragmented world. I might have modular production. I might need to cooperate with different startups, with different players in the different environment, for sure. But I think that's one of the fundamental changes. And I think that's also why this podcast, I think, is very useful, because it highlights these developments.
Yeah. Though I just wanted to highlight the naturality, how you make it simple, right? This is also our experience. We have been telling this for ages. And also, I must say, and I don't know if it's also your perception, it's time, and there are credible ways to do it. We now know how to organize companies this way. It's not as rocket science. It's just that leadership needs to embrace this new age and wholeheartedly say, okay, let's break down our company, let's empower our management, let's create networks and connect to the world in a way that is different from how we used to do in the past. But it's really there. It's not rocket science.
Yeah.
As we draw to a close, I would like to ask you a couple of breadcrumbs, reads, or I don't know, anything that comes to your mind, something that you are following, or newsletters, or podcasts you are listening to, or books you want to suggest to the listeners. Of course, your report, this is a fantastic piece of work that people should catch up with, but anything else that you want to point out?
I'm just reading and rereading a couple of books, which I think is quite interesting and which have to do a bit with my focus and could be interesting for your readers. One is Tim Marshall's The Power of Geography. That was the follow-up book to The Prisoners of Geography. And what I particularly like is that he wrote this, I think, in the late 2010s, picking up geographies like Iran, for example, or like Turkey, or like Greece, where I think we see that this area of the world is super relevant. And I think Tim has a very nice way of weaving geography with history, with economy. So I really enjoyed that book. And I think that's also something which is interesting for readers. Another book which I also like is from Richard Holloway, which is The Little History of Religion, which is more philosophical, but which is actually a very easy to read book. And I think, 150, 200 pages, describes an overview of all the religions from really prehistory to now, and also the question of a religion-free world, which I think is also interesting, because what you see when you do also things like the scenario work we are doing is, whether we like it or not, large parts of the world are following different religions. Religions have an impact on the way how we behave, on our cultures, and the way how we see the future. And so I found that book also quite interesting in showing the breadth and the difference that we see also in the mental maps that are impacting people governing this world or just acting in this world. So that would be my 2 breadcrumbs.
Most of the regional blocs we see nowadays are rooted in cosmological visions, and we see that with China, India, somehow also the US. It's another region, maybe it's religion, maybe it's capitalism, but it's somehow still a religion. So thank you so much for this end. I hope you also enjoyed the conversation. It was a good chat.
Yeah, thank you very much, Simone, for having me. I hope that our conversation is interesting for your audience and was interesting for your audience. And I'd welcome any comments from you or from your audience after they have had a look at the report. Very happy to engage.
Yeah. Of course, I want to stress the point to the listeners that you should really go and read Beyond Tomorrow. The report is fantastic, and it's a very good starting point if you want to think about the future in a practical and straightforward way. And thank you so much, Nikolaus. It was a pleasure to have you. And our listeners, of course, you can head to boundaryless.io/podcast. You will find the transcript, all the interesting bits that Nikolaus and myself, we pointed out during the conversation. And of course, until we speak again, remember to think boundaryless.